Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kernahan Webb. I am a professor in the Law and Business Department here at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I'm also the director of the Toronto Metropolitan University Institute for the Study of Corporate Social Responsibility. And it is in my latter capacity as the director of the CSR Institute that I'm very pleased today to have a chat with Hashim Jadoon with respect to, as you see the title here, Courtroom Victory for Mining Affected Pakistan Communities, in conversation with plaintiff lawyer Hashim Jadoon. And just want to mention as well that this particular session is co-sponsored by two excellent student organizations at Toronto Metropolitan University, one being the CSR Student Society, and the second being the Law and Business Student Association, LBSA. Next slide, please. A land acknowledgement here. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Next slide, please. All of these CSR Institute sessions, and indeed all work by the CSR Institute, is animated by this definition of social responsibility, which comes from the ISO 26000 standard. And in that standard, it's defines social responsibility as you see here, the responsibility of an organization for the impacts of its decisions and activities on society and the environment through transparent and ethical behavior that contributes to sustainable development, health and welfare, takes into account the expectations of stakeholders, is in compliance with applicable law and consistent with international norms of behavior, and is integrated throughout the organization and practiced in its relationships. Next slide, please. The second concept that animates everything that we do here at the CSR Institute is this concept of sustainable governance, which basically starts from the proposition that in the 21st century, where we're dealing with fast evolving issues, fast evolving technologies, and so on, and these tend to be multi-jurisdictional in impact, the most effective way of addressing that is by harnessing the unique energies and capabilities of all three, of government, the private sector, and civil society. So definitely using law, which is one example of a rule instrument, but there are also rule instruments that come from non-state entities like ISO, or like an industry association, or from an NGO, a non-governmental organization, but also through a variety of different processes. Again, legal processes like adjudication, but also non-state processes like certification to standards and so on. Institutions, yes, government institutions, but also non-state institutions, such as through industry associations or non-governmental organization institutions that have been set up, and through a variety of different actors. And sometimes it's all about a great deal of collaboration and cooperation among government, private sector, and civil society. And sometimes there's more of a rivalrous check and balance relationship between the three sets of actors, instruments, institutions, and processes. But it's through that combination in the 21st century that we have more likelihood of being able to effectively address any particular issue that arises, as opposed to relying on only one of those, which makes you vulnerable if anything should happen to that one thing that you're relying on. Next slide, please. Just to note that this particular CSR Institute session is part of a long series of CSR Institute sessions that we are holding with a variety of different people from government, from the private sector, from civil society. The idea with respect to all of them is to have constructive engagement to further understanding on issues by tapping into subject matter experts on particular topics or issues where they are particularly well positioned to say something. And certainly Hashim is a good example of that. And we'll be speaking directly about Hashim and then to Hashim in a moment. Just a note that we have some other sessions coming up on January 16th, for example, in 2026. We'll be talking to Henty Durker, who is the individual responsibility for compliance and integrity at Atkins Realis, which is a very large Canadian multinational corporation. And then on January 23rd, we'll be talking to Lotana Nwadu, who is a lawyer in Nigeria, and he's going to be talking about legislated impact benefit agreements, which is a topic that we're going to be touching on here today when we talk about what's going on in Pakistan with Hashim. So we're always open to ideas for new in-conversation sessions, such as the one we're having today. Just email me. There's the email address. You can see it there. And I'll see if we can pursue that. Also, to let you know that there is an ongoing project that the CSR Institute is leading on, and that's with respect to the rule of law, which is another topic that we will be, Hashim and I will be talking about in a moment here. So all of these talks are available at no cost and are accessible free after the fact as videos. And if you go up to the CSR Institute website, you can click on any previous session and you can go to the video of that particular session. TMU has ranked very well, very highly with respect to its CSR work, as you can see there. And there's a lot of interesting news items that are coming up these days pertaining to TMU and the CSR Institute. So again, if you go up on the website, you can, the CSR Institute website, you can click on that. And if you'd like to be on a email list with respect to upcoming CSR Institute talks, again, just email me and I will put you on that list. Next slide, please. So finally, we can get around to a little bit of background about Hashim. So Hashim grew up in Canada. He obtained his Bachelor of Commerce degree with a law major from Toronto Metropolitan University. Now, is that correct, 2016, or was that 2014 that you graduated, Hashim?
No, I graduated in 2016.
Oh, you did graduate in 2016. Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. And then you proceeded to get a law degree from the University of London. And then he returned back to Pakistan, where he became an expert. And as a result of that, it ended up him being involved in this particular litigation that we'll be speaking about here. So one more slide, please. Particularly for those of you who are patching in from outside of Canada, for example, from Asia or Africa or Europe, much appreciated that you'd be doing that because you're patching in at a kind of an oddball time of day or night. Also, welcome, obviously, to all of those patching in from Canada, or United States, where the time zones are comparatively similar to where we are now. But welcome to you all. If you do have a thought or a question as the session proceeds, just email me at the email address that you see there, and I'll do my best to fold in your questions and comments into the conversation as we go along. So thanks, Luke. That's it for the slide. So welcome, Hashim, to this particular session. What I often do when I start off these sessions is I say, Hashim, take me back to when you were a very small child in a sandbox with your loving parents looking down on you as you played in the sandbox. Did you ever think that you'd be looking up from that sandbox and saying to your parents, Mommy, Daddy, when I grow up, I'd like to go back to Pakistan and become a lawyer and be defending communities against business interests. Was that ever in the cards, or have you known from the time you were a small child that this is what you would do?
That's a very good question, Dr. Webb. And no, when I was playing the sandbox, I was in Canada in a very different life from where I am now. And I always saw myself spending the rest of my life in Canada. So when I was in 1999 was when we emigrated to Canada. And it was a completely different lifestyle, a completely different world. Here in Pakistan, we were used to blackouts, brownouts, no internet, lack of cell phone communication services. And now when looking back at it, when I was younger, I even remember thinking to myself or even talking to my parents, like, hey, I'm never going to go back. And lo and behold, fate, it brought me back. So I guess when I was growing up, I never in my life would have imagined that I would be defending the rights of the people here. I never in my life would have thought I'd be living here, never thought I'd be working here. Not always, but when I was young, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I wanted to be a Bay Street lawyer. I wanted to be Harvey Specter. I grew up when Suits was it was first running, so I had a very different mindset and a very different mentality. But now, at this point in my life, honestly, I am astonished that I am here. So it's very surprising.
It's remarkable how many people, including myself, who never thought they would be where they are now, back when they were very young. It was not an aspiration when they were young to do anything in particular of this nature. This is not to say that any of us, when we were young, didn't think that we'd be doing something interesting, but this sort of thing, corporate social responsibility, law, for most of us, when we were younger, now we're all in this space. But when we were younger, it was not in the cards, particularly. But that's interesting that all along you thought that you wanted to be a lawyer. So you went to Toronto Metropolitan University, or at the time that you were there, it was Ryerson University. But you went there and you got your Bachelor of Commerce degree. And you and I were talking about that and how, you took courses from me and I was saying various things. And a lot of them were kind of not particularly hitting home with you because at the time you were not imagining that particularly impact benefit agreements that Professor Webb is talking about in a corporate social responsibility in the law class would be something that would be, directly relevant to where you are. But so you got your Bachelor of Commerce degree, you came out with your Bachelor of Commerce degree, and then what took you to London to get your law degree as opposed to getting a law degree here in Canada? Was there any particular thinking on that, or was it just because that was available?
So what happened was when I'm just gonna like give a little background from high school. So I went to high school in Unionville High School, and it was an arts oriented high school, but it was one of the best schools I think in the province. It was very well ranked, and I had a teacher back then, and he I took his law class and he said, hey, this class is really going to prepare you for university. And at the time I didn't understand what he meant, but he wanted us to focus on academic writing with proper citations and references. And at the time that made no sense to me because we didn't credit people for their work, and it was not just paraphrasing, it was a lot more copy pasting than paraphrasing at the time. And in 2000, from 2012 and to 2016, when I did my BCom, I think the other class that really helped me out with academic writing was your class because you had us develop a habit of reading articles, and those articles were very, very dense, very boring at the time, but very helpful. And it was very tough to gauge back then that they were going to be very helpful. There was a lot of concepts that I took actually from that CSR class that I think were very applicable to law school. And what I want, basically, it was the modality at which you taught us, where you had us back up and reference each and every point that we made. So it was very logic focused, and it was very, hey, back up what you're saying with some credible sources. And when I look back at it and I see it now, that's exactly what the law is and how you practice in the courtroom. Like if you're making a point, then at least substantiate it with some form of evidence. So in 2016. right? Every year, as soon as exams finish, I remember posting on Facebook, I would just write freedom with lots of exclamation marks, like finally exams are over, we get to relax. And in 2016, after our exams finished and I graduated, there was a different sense of freedom. And we went to Pakistan for our summer vacation. And the University of London affiliate campus was actually in Pakistan. It was in the capital city of Islamabad. So what happened then was my cousin, he was actually studying at UOL, and he said, "Hey, our law degrees are 3 years," and I was like, "Wow, that's shorter than our Canadian ones because I think ours were 4 years, I believe, in Canada." And
No, there's three, but then there's
there's three.
articling after
Okay,
that. Yeah.
yeah, articling and stuff. Yeah. So when I looked into it, there was something because I already had a BCom, I was a graduate entry, which actually reduced my degree to 2 years. And I was like,
Okay.
that's pretty cool. So 2 years. And I was like, you know what, 2 years will just fly by. Let me just give it a shot. So all of our courses, we learned the UK law, like contract law, civil law, criminal, tort, trust, property, all of it. So when I did it in from Islamabad in Pakistan, I was like, okay, now I'm prepared. I can just go back and do my NCAs. And the reason why I focused on it here, I think, was basically the time. I didn't know about the NCAA is the National Accreditation Authority. It's a different route for foreigners who are coming back to Canada, and they have to get recredited by the Canadian body, but it actually ends up taking a longer time. But at that time, I was like, hey, 2 years here and then go back to Canada and just enjoy it. But that's not what happened. After the 2 years, I was like, you know what? Why don't I just give the law a shot here? And I started working. It was very different. It was very different from what I was used to because here in Canada, while I was in my last year of university, I was working with the Ministry of the Attorney General. And I was a court reporter at the Ontario Court of Justice. So 311 Jarvis, it's right by Ted Rogers. And
Yeah.
then there was one on, I think it was, there's one on Bay Street or University Street. There's one on College. And there's one, I worked at Young and Shepherd. I believe that's the one that I was at. And so while I was doing my last year at university, I got to see all of these cool trials. Like I did it at youth court, youth criminal, and small claims court. So it was very interesting. I had to meet fascinating character like individuals, lawyers, the judges. I really just the fact that we got to be the court reporters or the court registrars for small claims court. So we had a one-on-one relationship with the judge. I would ask them questions all the time, like how did you get here and why do you love it? Why do you do what you do? So I really enjoyed it. But getting back to your question, so when I did it in Pakistan, I was like, this is a completely different avenue or a different field than it was in Canada. But I felt like my experience from Canada actually gave me a huge advantage here. And but I promise you, the first 2 years, 3 years, I had no idea what was going on because it was the court decorum was not the same as it was in Canada. Like I was used to a very professional court, like nobody talks, everybody is courteous. But here in Pakistan, it was like how do I explain it? It's like a it's like a farmer's market, a disorganized farmer's market. It's just it's a free for all. It's whoever the judge can have his trial on one end, and then on the right side, the court clerk will be speaking with the litigants, and then in the background there might be like a settlement conference happening, and nobody cares about the volume, and it's very dysfunctional. So when I started doing it here, I was like, there's no way I can do this, but I persevered and we have different courts here. So, like in Canada, um, we have small claims, we have family courts, and then we get to the Ontario Superior Court, which I believe has some of our. I think it's an appellate body as well, if I'm not wrong. I believe there's appeals court there. So here in Pakistan, because we were a British colony, we still follow like a British type of judicial system. So we've got our district or lower courts, and then above that is the High Court, and then the Supreme Court. So I went to the High Court. I was like, okay, this is professional. I was like, this is law oriented. There's a lot of discussion about law and there's no there's no farmers market taking place. So I started focusing exclusively in the high court, whereas everybody told me they said, "Don't do that. Go to trial. Learn how to do lower court." And I said, "No, it's not for me. It's very different. It's not. It doesn't suit my nature." And when I started practicing routine in the high court, I was like, "This is where I can excel because." a lot of the proceedings were in English. All of our laws are in English, because it's very British inspired. So yeah, I never imagined, like, the particular reason was basically just time, and then understanding that I had a big competitive advantage here than I would in Canada. So I figured that perhaps just doing it right here, I could get bigger results in a shorter amount of time.
So there you were. You're in the village where I guess your family had come from, and you're experiencing. Everybody in the community is experiencing a lot of this crushing activity going on very nearby, and very interesting how you initially used the local approaches for dialogue among community to broach the topic of, hey, what exactly is going on here? So take the story over from there, and we'll proceed.
Yeah. So it was actually me and my brother, and I think he's even in the Zoom call right now. But me and my brother, we were just sitting and we were discussing like what to do about all of this. And
What would you
we
explain all of this? Just explain a little bit of the all of
okay,
this.
yeah. So before filing a case, because there's a massive societal stigma about filing a case against your own family. So prior to me filing a case, I did my research. I had no idea who owned these crush machines. So crush machines are these electrical units that grind big boulders into smaller, more refined building material. And in that process, they emit a lot of it's not smoke, it's literally the stones being grinded into dust.
Dust. Yeah.
Yeah. So if they don't have air filters or water filters, then that dust is just being emitted. So imagine a 24/7 type of machine crushing boulders into small dust. So that produces a lot of dust because you're essentially converting a solid mountain into like a dust form. So
Right.
when me and my brother, and it's roughly about, I want to say it's about like 800 feet from my house. So it basically, my brother and I, we were sitting on outside, and we were wondering, we were trying to develop a good, like, strategy. Or sorry, before that, I actually spoke to all of my village elders to get an understanding of, hey, who owns these machines? Like, I have no idea. I haven't been here in 20 years. I don't know who owns them. And then as I started compiling pieces of information, I realized, like, oh, it's my own relatives. And I was like, that's no problem at all. If I just ask them nicely, they're obviously going to listen. And because, this is a big problem for our health. So I was very naive at the time. I thought, I thought very in like an idealistic manner. So when we realized that, okay, so in order for it would be better if we called in our culture or in our language, it's called a jirga. So a jirga is like a communal meeting. So because I live in a village, our village has a community center. So inside of the community center, we call the jirga, and that's where the heads of the households of the families all gather, and we broach this topic, and we said, hey, we're all brothers here. We live in a community-based society,
It
so
is, sorry,
for
Hashim, it is an all male thing. Is that right? The Jirga
the
is an all
Jirga,
male.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. Predominantly, yes, it is. It's all male. So, in that meeting, everybody was sitting there, including the village elders, as you would see, and there were younger folks as well. And then there was my brother and I, and we were explaining why this needs to stop. And we were explaining, it's better for everybody because there's a lot of health issues. The road was completely destroyed. Because as you can imagine, I don't know if students have read the article or not, but some of the pictures that I took, they incorporate that the entire mountain has been utterly destroyed. So we were trying to present logical arguments. So arguments of logic were not they were not appealing to them. So we realized, like, okay, we need to perhaps take this to litigation. And because it was against our own family, it was a huge societal stigma. And that was there was a lot of pressure there, but because we had the support of our parents, and that mattered more than anything. My brother and I, so it was my brother and I, we started this by going to the Environmental Protection Tribunal, which was the first, it's the first forum that you have to go to pursue environmental cases. And that was about 3 hours, 3.5 hours away from our house in a totally different city. So we'd have to wake up at 5 in the morning because we thought that, court would start on time, 9 a.m. sharp. Like we would be there. So we would be there at 9 a.m. sharp. And, it was more relaxed than I realized because it was our first ever experience. At the time, I only had my district court license. So I was a junior lawyer. And I didn't like, keep in mind, remember, I never went to trial court here in Pakistan. I didn't want to do it. So it was my very first experience. And I said, you know what? Like, we have to do something. And my brother, he supported me throughout every single one of those proceedings, and that mattered a lot too. So it all started from the Jirga, and then it went to the courtroom.
Before you get any further in that, you
Yeah.
did your homework with respect to ownership of these particular properties that where the extraction was going on and the crushing was going on, and you found some interesting things about that as well, which I understand you actually brought to the attention of the members of the community in the Jirga. Can you just explain a little bit about that? Um,
Yeah. So there's different types of properties. So you've got your freehold property, you have leasehold properties, and then here in our society, there's a it's called shamlat, which means it's a communal property or a collective ownership. And I actually had a very good friend of mine, Adnan. He knew a lot about property law, and he's younger than me. He's interested in the same subject, but property documents here in Pakistan are very difficult for us to read. By us, I mean somebody who hasn't lived in Pakistan, who doesn't is not fluent in the language, and even the property documents are just by design they're meant to be very difficult to read. So, what we understood from the property documents was that the crushing and the mining was actually taking place on communal property. So once we started thinking about it logically, and the law said the same thing, well, you would obviously need the permission of the landlords or the owners of the property to mine their property. So when we asked the various elders, we were like, "Hey, how do they have ownership of this?" And they're like, "Oh, no, they're not owners. It's communal property." And then we're like, "Okay, so did the community give them permission?" They were like, "Well, no. There's about 5 or 6 people who are collecting rent, but nobody else is." And we were like, that's insane because it's a mountain. Keep in mind, it's hundreds of acres of mountain, right? It's not as if there's like two or three owners. It's an entire community. There's hundreds of owners. So when we started getting into the mix of what exactly was going on, we were like, this is crazy. So my brother and I initially we were so very confused as to, well, why is nobody speaking out against this? This seems absolutely insane. But at that time, I didn't understand. I underestimated culture and societal pressure and how big of a detriment or how big of a barrier that can be to achieving justice. And it's very funny because I remember I was at a wedding and I was eating it was in our village, and we were having lunch at the groom's house, and I was sitting with the leaseholder. And at that point in time, I knew he was the leaseholder, and I said, "Hey, are you the leaseholder?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, would it financially harm you if I shut down these machines?" He's like, "Well, yeah." And I was like, and I laughed, and I was like, "Well, I'm gonna do it anyways because this is crazy." And he laughed too because he didn't take it seriously at that time, and I don't think I was fully convinced that I was serious at that time too. But so that's kind of how it all started. Just understanding and recognizing, like, hey, this is a big community problem, not just because we live here and because our health is at risk, but also because it's community land that is not being used by the permission of the community. Because in our culture, we have land records, and this might not be legal as much as it is cultural. There's a big land record or big document that's called a wajibul arz. So the wajibul arz is a historic land agreement or a contract of what the community is allowed to do with this land. So the purpose or designation of this land was for the grazing of goats and cows, and the villagers are not that rich. They rely on agriculture. They rely on their animals. So that's what the purpose of this land was originally supposed to be. So the original purpose and what became of the land are two very different things. So that was something over time that I had to really understand because I don't think property rights like that are typically found in Canada. So it's difficult. The entire concept was very difficult for me to grasp, but I had help along the way to explain it to me.
Well, it is interesting to point out that almost no matter where it is you go around the world, there is quote unquote the way things have been done for a long time. And then there's an overlay of law, right? And they're not necessarily the two go together very well. And oftentimes the way things were originally done by indigenous persons, as the case might be, or just by communities, is and by agreement communal agreement of people does not actually align well with law, which is kind of like a grid that's imposed on top of that. And that's oftentimes where a huge amount of friction happens because how do you reconcile that pre-existing culture-based set of norms about how to behave with this codified, crystallized, more formal legal approach. And you essentially kind of walked in the door on that and kind of experienced it firsthand. But please do carry on. You went to the environmental tribunal, and
Yeah.
this is your first real trial experience. How did that go?
So actually that was very difficult. And when we went to trial, I was expecting something completely different. But so what happened was that I think that a lot of it was taken not so seriously, probably because typically lawyers here are a lot older. And typically in that particular forum, the Environmental Protection Tribunal, because environmental law in Pakistan has not been developed at all. So the way that one can approach the tribunal is either the department, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, it itself can file a complaint before the tribunal, or a private complainant can also file a complaint. And we were the only private complainants in the last, I don't know how many years, who had filed a complaint before the Environmental Protection Tribunal, and everybody was shook. They're like, "Who are you? Where did you come from? And you don't even speak our language. Like, you're just out here speaking English," and it was difficult to communicate with the judge because he was from. So in my city, our we typically speak Urdu and Hindko, and in their city Peshawar, they mostly speak Pashto. So the judges, there was a language barrier as well. It was a big language barrier to kind of get them to understand what was going on. But as time passed, I realized my opponents didn't take it seriously either because they were just like, "Who's this kid wasting our time? Like, why is he here?" And I remember even in the first few hearings, it was just me and my brother versus about 15 people. So there's fear involved, like there's pressure, you're worried, it's a small courtroom, but I had my brother with me, so then I realized like what am I afraid of? Who cares? And it was we went in June 2020 2022, and in November 2022 the proceedings were indefinitely adjourned. And I was confused, like, why is it indefinitely adjourned? And it was indefinitely adjourned because there were simultaneous proceedings going on in the High Court revolving around overall environmental compliance. And the High Court, for the first time in March 2022, they had issued a big order, and they had taken notice of this particular area. So I live in an area known as Tindiani. It's a popular tourist destination, so I live on Tindiani Road. And the High Court had said, hey, crushing and mining activity should be banned in this area. But that was purely of the High Court's own cognizance. It wasn't because of some particular legal argument or some sort of an evidence was adduced before the court. It was more so of the general environmental scope. So when we went to the criminal trial actually never even commenced. None of the accused, like, they were not charged for anything. So that was indefinitely halted in 2021. And at the time, so remember, I didn't know how to approach that. And I was like, okay, so what's our next solution? So in our country, we have in the municipalities, there's something called the deputy commissioner and the assistant commissioner. I don't know what would be the equivalent of it, but imagine that they are they're officers of the executive branch that have quasi judicial powers, and they can exercise powers to immediately seal premises or resolve solutions immediately for the citizens. So those are the DC and the AC, the deputy commissioner and the assistant commissioner. So the DC is the king of the city, essentially. So my brother and I, and my dad, my father, so we actually prepared a formal written invitation. We said, "Hey, concerned citizens, if you guys are aggrieved by the actions of the crush machines, come to the DC's office at this specified time and date." So the date was March 8th, 2023. And I remember all of these dates because I've written this 1,000 times. I've argued this 1,000 times. So we went to the DC's office, and about 116 people showed up. We got signatures from about 67 people, but a lot of people showed up, and there was a big like, whoa! Everybody was like, "This is the first time anything like this has happened," and it was just it was pretty cool at the time. And we pleaded our case to the deputy commissioner, and he sent his assistant commissioner, and he sealed all the crush machines immediately. And I brought those court orders, but keep in mind the DCs and the ACs are not trained lawyers; they are executive functionaries, so they just exercise a lot of power, and they generally there's a perception about like, hey, you don't mess with the DC or the AC. So that time, my understanding of the law was not as developed as it is now. So when that happened, everybody went crazy because it was like the first time that these machines had been sealed in so many years. And that's when the first round of litigation also commenced by the crush plant owners. So they went to the high court and they filed a what we call a writ petition. So they argued that their fundamental rights were violated by the actions of the executive. And that's where we ended up in the high court for the first time. And once again, that's so I was the youngest lawyer at the time. I had my high court license, and my opponents, they hired the top lawyers of the city, and it was tough. And that's where the first round of litigation commenced. And from March until June, the case went in our favor, and the decision came on August 16, 2023. And the court decided that, okay, the assistant commissioner had sealed your machines without giving you due warning, and that's a violation of your right to due process. So that was illegal of him. However, you should not be, your machines cannot operate without proper environmental clearances. But I didn't realize it at the time. Every single one of the crush machines was relying on a letterhead that we call a no objection certificate, or an NOC. So it was essentially a permission slip that said you have the right to operate this crush plant,
Ah.
and this was a permission given by somebody who could not exercise that authority. And so, like, imagine we have driver's license, you can't
Mhm,
drive your
mhm.
car. If a policeman wrote to you on the paper like, Professor Webb, you can now drive a vehicle here. Just show this to
Yes,
anybody who
yes.
cares. So, in essence, for the past I don't know how many years, 10 years, everybody had been using an NOC to operate the crush plant. And I,
We have a joke for that. The joke is,
yeah,
I, for example, could say to you, with all the authority vested in me, I hereby grant you the da da da. Of course, I have no authority, so that's essentially what you're
exactly.
talking. So that's a little joke. But anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So that's where the first round of litigation ended. So what happened was that I was pretty happy. I was ecstatic, like, hey, we got a neutral decision. But the court did say that they can't operate without, the environmental permission. So uh, they started operating their machines because they interpreted it as, hey, we won the orders in our favor. So that created a lot of societal I would say
Turmoil.
disappointment, yeah,
Mhm.
turmoil, and also a complete disappointment in the judicial system. And I remember at the time I was very upset because I was like, what is this garbage? I was like, I can read English. I know that they didn't give you permission to operate it, but I did not understand how one goes about conveying their grievance to the court. Because keep in mind, like, just imagine I'm absolutely doing this all on my own. I don't have somebody helping me out, and I did ask a lot of the senior lawyers, like, hey guys, can you help me out? Like, I'm new to this system. This is really weird. I don't understand any of this because this makes no sense to me. And everybody was like, yeah, sure, well, whatever, man, we'll help you out. But it wasn't like that. So a lot of it was I wanted to give up, but my family, they were the ones who convinced me, like, don't give up. And I spent a lot of time. Like, I started building my library. I read through all of these books. I got better at the language. I started doing my research, and, like, maybe people can relate to this. I started really researching who had done environmental cases in the country, and I contacted each and every single one of them. Like, I want you to imagine that I went through every single case you could imagine about environmental law and environmental compliance in Pakistan. And I went and read through all of them, and I started finding the plaintiffs, the petitioners, the lawyers of the petitioners, who lost, who won, the judges, and I went through all their decisions, and I started contacting the people, and my network started to build up. So now I had found, okay, so this is the lawyer that is really good at environmental law. Okay, so this petitioner has repeatedly litigated. Okay, so this judge really cares about environmental law. And as I understood it, I began my own legal acumen developed at a very quick pace because I would obsess over it because I was like, I'm going to destroy and defeat like these are the bad guys. Like I need to crush them, you know? And as my acumen went up, my confidence, my skill started developing, and actually I started taking more cases, not just these crush machine cases. And that's when I really started getting a deeper understanding of exactly what constitutional law is. And so the high court is the court where you deal with constitutional law, specifically when the executive or the government violates your fundamental rights, or the government conducts some action that it does not have the legislative backing to do. So that was very fundamental to my understanding because I didn't understand that at the time. Because remember, I think Professor Webb, you can appreciate this. The tribunal was a criminal court, but it wasn't really concerned that much with the constitutional aspect. It was like, okay, what's the penalty? How can I punish these
Mhm.
people? Whereas the constitutional court was like, okay, why don't you tell me about which one of your rights are being infringed? So, well,
Just
as I
also on
started,
that point, Hashim,
yeah,
I know up until now you've been framing it in environmental terms, but this gravel crushing uh, activity was going on very close to a girls' school, right?
yes,
Um,
yeah,
and there are health effects. It's not just environmental effects. The dust is toxic dust, and so this is simultaneously a health as well as a broader ecosystem environmental impact that we're talking about.
yeah,
Is that correct? Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
So Dr. Webb, it's like so there's actually two there's a primary school and a girls' high school as well. So there's actually two schools, and they quite literally border right next to the mining pit, so the quarry. So the procedure for extracting the boulders is you can either use an excavator to excavate the boulders, and they're going to fall off the edge of the cliff, or for
Dynamite.
cost efficient purposes, dynamite. So the
Hmm.
dynamite, it was not some sort of scientifically conducted. No, it was just
Hmm.
here. Let's shove some dynamite. Let's put in X amount of kilograms or pounds of dynamite and just see what happens. So the dynamite, it would explode, and the crowd, like our house, would shake, and not just our house, like everybody's house in the village would shake, and it literally would feel like an earthquake. And the girls' high school, the cracks began developing like that, and it wasn't just like a ordinary school. It had a smart board, it had computer labs. It was an effort by the government to promote education within our village. And as this would happen, I remember me and my brother visited the school. The school had literally boarded up their windows in order to prevent dust from seeping in, because the machines didn't have any sort of dust pollution mechanisms, and the explosion, like after you blast the dynamite, it creates a cloud of dust. And
Right.
just to imagine our city. So the city that I live in is called Aptabad. Aptabad is like a bowl. It's bordered by mountains. It's all around is mountains. So if you break a piece of that bowl, like it affects the wind patterns, the geography, the water, everything about the city gets affected. And it's
Right.
not as if the dust just like sits there. It goes through the entire city, and it creates a layer all over because we're at a pretty high elevation. My village, it's not like we're above sea level. So
It's a mountain
uh
village. Yeah.
yeah, it's a mountain. Yeah, so that dust, it creates like it literally creates a layer throughout the entire city. So yeah, those health benefits, they were very significant because everybody, like literally everybody in our village had asthma or some sort of respiratory problems, and um, it was definitely, this was a major factor for it,
Good.
unfortunately.
Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. Carrying on now
Yeah.
with the legal story.
Yeah, so the nerdy legal story behind it all was that the tribunal proved to be an ineffective remedy. So we went to high court jurisdiction, and after that August 16, 2023 decision, our opponents, the Crush machine owners, I refer to them as the Crush Bros filed what is called a review petition. The review petition is essentially asking the court to review your judgment because we think you did something wrong. And the laws of in our country is review petitions are typically heard by the same bench that passed the original judgment. That didn't happen in our case for some unusual reason. And that's when I started to understand, okay, so these guys are like, what is it that they're doing to me that I'm not understanding? They were using administrative tricks that I didn't recognize. So a lot of the reason why our judicial system, many of the public believe that it's incompetent is because a lot of the administrative staff does like the leg pulling, and they're pulling the strings, so certain cases might not be fixed where they ought to be fixed. So our case randomly from Abtabad went to the other city of Peshawar, and I was like, how did it get here? Like, it shouldn't be here. So then I had to go, so this was done all with our own resources, time, money, everything is done at my family's expense, mine, my brothers, everybody. So um, we went to Peshawar, and we actually approached the Chief Justice of the High Court, and we said, "Hey, you're like, something weird is going on. This not only is the judgment not being complied with, but there's a review petition, and somehow it's not even before the original bench. It's in another city altogether." So things like, I started understanding. Okay, so this is the trick that they're using. Like, this is, an older experienced lawyer. He was beating me with experience, and
Yes.
yeah, it enraged me like more than you can imagine. It angered me. It bothered me because I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, this is not the law. This is not skill. This is just experience. But then as time went on, so imagine now review petitions, they're still illegally operating their crush plants. We finally get a judgment. The review petition, the judge says, hey, like, we're not reviewing our judgment. You guys can't operate without proper environmental compliances. And I was like, wow, we finally won the review, but that's nothing happened even after that. And I was utterly stunned. I was like, what is going on? This makes no sense. And that's when I understood the importance of court directions and the specific, like, you need a proper direction to a specific authority to do something, right? It can't just be a general statement. So what happened after that was that for the first time ever, I think, luck changed it towards my favor. On November 2024, the chairperson of the Environmental Protection Tribunal, because the old chairperson, he resigned, and for 2 years, the tribunal was dysfunctional in our entire province. So after 2 years, a new chairman was appointed, and this chairman revived our case. So the proceedings were once again revived, and now a proper criminal trial was commencing. He ordered, okay, all the accused come in person, submit your bail bonds. Here are the conditions. And I had also filed an interim relief application. And now keep in mind, I don't know if the students might understand this, but the tribunal was primarily a criminal court. However, an interim relief is a civil remedy. So when I got my interim relief on March 11, 2025, they filed a writ petition against that order of the tribunal because they said, hey, how did he award civil relief in the criminal matter? And this became a big question before the High Court. And for the first time ever, I had absolute confidence that I now know how to beat all of them because I now had the knowledge. I now understood. As time progressed, the Supreme Court passed significant orders relating to crush plants, and my brother and I were a member of the committee. We helped write the report. Like the lead lawyer, I began networking with. So the Supreme Court also like, there was developments happening in the same time frame. So when they filed a writ petition, that's the case, the landmark judgment that came in my favor was because it was a culmination of all the research that I've done. And they had hired about 8 lawyers against me, and they had their juniors, so it was one on like 20. And I remember the absolute confidence. Like, we were sitting in the bar room with the other lawyers, and they were all older than me, and they were the top lawyers of the city. And I said, I want you guys to try your absolute best. And I was like, do it so that I can have fun because I'm going to win. And they got so angry. They were like, the arrogance, like, who does he think he is? And I was like, no, you cannot beat me. I was like, it's not 2022 anymore. Things like, I now understand exactly what the constitutional law is, what criminal law is, what civil law is. And so as this case was happening, typically there's a belief in Pakistan that cases last for 40 years because they really do. Trials go on forever because of a lack of evidence, because just there's a complete
Technicalities.
Yeah, technicalities and a complete relaxation. It's the fault of both the judiciary as well as the lawyers because the judiciary permits indefinite delays and the lawyers want indefinite delays. So our case began in April 2023 or 25, and it was we received our judgment on I believe it was June or May 19th, 2025. So within the span of like 1 month, 1.5 months, a landmark judgment that like it was landmark because I don't think any judgment like that exists in Pakistan at all, because it gave a very definitive ruling on the powers of tribunals, at least in our province. It said, hey, the question is not whether this is a civil remedy or a criminal remedy. The question is that I am a constitutional court. There's an allegation here that the citizens have a right to life, which was our Article 9 fundamental right, and the Constitution was recently amended that Article 9A was inserted into the Constitution, which said that we have the right to a sustainable environment. So I said, you as a constitutional creature, you cannot simply ignore or you cannot give an unjust decision based off of mere technicalities. And I supported it with Supreme Court judgments and with precedents. And I said, this has already been decided. Like you don't need to vote because they this was the point that they were pushing really heavily. They were like, it doesn't matter about the tribunal. The tribunal cannot pass an interim order. And the High Court interpreted it completely different. And and I developed the argument of what is an NOC, and I explained to them that every single crush machine in the entire province is operating illegally, that for the past whatever how many decades the entire regime of this industry has been utilizing a permission slip from some guy to just say, hey, you're allowed to do this and we don't care. And I said, it doesn't matter what some guy says, the law is this, the constitution is this, and you have to do this. And the high court agreed primarily with what I was saying, and I said they're going to argue that they have a right to conduct business, but that doesn't supersede the right to life, nor does it supersede the right that the law requires you to do something a particular way. And the high court largely agreed with everything that I had to say. And to this day, that they still don't understand. Allegations were made that, oh, he probably bribed the judge is his friend, this and that, because it led to a lot of professional jealousy. They were like, how did the youngest lawyer beat the top lawyers? Like, and it was a big moment because that judgment, it really redefined environmental law. And I actually got contacted by everybody from all the other provinces. So we have 4 provinces. We have, so from different provinces they came and they said, help us out too. Like our judges don't understand this concept. And the way that I did, I drafted my arguments in written submissions because I remember in Canada everything was so professionally typed. Everything was, everything in writing. So I followed the same thing, like really picked up on the things that I learned at my time at court, as well as what I learned
Mhm.
from university. And
Right.
when I look back at it, I explained to people, they're like, "How did you do it?" I was like, "Man, it's the foundation that I have. I underestimated the education that I received from TMU. I didn't understand it back then, but no, I promise, like anybody listening, it is an absolute advantage. It's not even a competitive advantage. It is an absolute advantage. So yeah,
Let's
it was
let's
just a
talk for a minute about what the order was, though. So there were like
yeah,
900 different crush machines or operations in your province
yeah,
alone that were
yes.
required to shut down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what the judgment said that it canceled any concept of an NOC, provisional, like a permission, anything that was not an I. So there's only 2 ways to do this. You can either have an initial environmental examination or an environmental impact assessment. So either an IEE or an EIA. And our law mandates that crush machines must have an IEE. And in order for you to have an IEE, you have to fulfill certain requirements of the government. The government has to exercise its judicial mind, and it has to determine whether your crush plan complies with environmental standards. What everybody else was relying on was a conditional approval, a conditional license, an NOC, something that did not exist. It was not a creature of statute. It was just simply something on the piece of paper. And when I brought this to the knowledge of the court, they were absolutely baffled because so our apex court is the high court in our province. So the high court was utterly stunned because I said the entire reason why this regime is ridiculous or why everybody's gotten away with it is because nobody has ever brought this to the court's attention. And I honestly have no idea why. It might be because of a lack of understanding, or it might be because of fear of the crushing mafia. I don't know. But when we brought that to the knowledge of the court said from this point forward, all of these NOCs are they're null and void. They're without jurisdiction. As soon as that happened, every single crush plan lost the validity that it was using. And the High Court, in its final direction, it said the administration, so the DC and the AC, and especially the EPA, has a mandate to take action against anyone and everyone in violation of the law of the EPA. So it turned out that everyone was in violation of the EPA's law. So after that happened, all of a sudden, my Environmental Protection Tribunal, it just got 1,000 more cases, and their workload, because remember the EPA has to file complaints before the tribunal to convict them of this environmental offense. So as soon as that happened, then people also started filing their own writ petitions, because the High Court also ruled that one of the arguments was that, hey, the High Court does not have jurisdiction because pursuant to the law, the primary jurisdiction lies with the tribunal. And the High Court, and I convinced the High Court with this argument. I said, well, I would agree. However, because there's an inaction of the regulator itself, as in the EPA itself is not doing its job, it would be insane that the citizens lose the right to approach the High Court because the government is not doing its job. And the High Court agreed. He said, hey, you can approach me directly because the government is not doing its job and your fundamental rights are being violated. So it was very fascinating. Technically, like I often tell my opponents this, or my crush plan. I said, hey, I want to thank you guys. You guys taught me more law than you can imagine. Like just understanding these nuances, it goes a long way. So it's very fascinating.
Now, the uh, couple points. One is just to be clear here, the audience that you're speaking to now includes government officials, private sector companies, consultants, NGOs from around the world. It's not just students. There are students from TMU who are patching in for this, but your audience is much more than just the students, just to be clear on that point. Second point is the Constitution of Pakistan. Does it have, since I know you're familiar with the Canadian Constitution and in particular the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, there are the
Yep.
rights, but then there's Section 1, which you remember Section 1.
The
Section 1,
notwithstanding clause, I think.
the notwithstanding clause. Well,
Yeah.
actually, no, it's not the notwithstanding clause.
Oh,
No, Section 1 says, well, in a free and democratic society, if the government is doing something that they can justify is necessary in a free and democratic society, it can actually override, the court can override a particular right. No, I'm just asking you, we don't need to go down this rabbit hole deeply,
yeah.
but is there anything like that in the Constitution of Pakistan, or are the rights, such as the Section 9 right that you're referring to, once
Yeah.
you've established that there has been a right and an infringement of that right, there is no equivalent of Section 1, which could be used by a court to say, yes, this particular infringement is an infringement contrary to the Constitution. However, it is acceptable in a free and democratic society because they're addressing, for example, pressing societal needs. There's nothing like that in the Pakistan Constitution.
So there's two ways that I'm going to answer your question. I believe there is nothing like that in the Constitution, and secondly, the courts have made interpretations that can be very questionable that amount to uh, Article 1 of the Canadian Constitution. But the thing that actually happens and has historically happened throughout Pakistan's history, so Pakistan, for half of its history, has been ruled by a military democracy, and the other half by a civil government, or a civilian government, sorry. So what happens is that typically the constitution gets abrogated in some manner, and in its place there is a fake constitution, which is often called a provisional constitutional order, a PCO. And then the judiciary, or the judiciary that follows the chief martial law administrator, gets sworn in, and then that judiciary upholds the validity of the PCO, and it says, okay, so now that this constitution has been abrogated, we will now give you a
Mm,
different opinion as to why your fundamental rights require to be violated. So
right.
this happened in 1956, it happened in 1963, and it happened in 1973. We've had three different utterance or three different iterations of our constitution. So presently we're at the 1973 constitution. So every time this happens, the Constitution typically gets suspended, abrogated, and then yeah, PCO gets filed, and then a Supreme Court or new judges who are sworn in as Supreme Courts, they uphold the validity of it, and they actually did something. This happened all the way back in when the very first Constitution got suspended. I think in '56. The judges relied on something called the doctrine of necessity. And they said because the civilian machinery has broken down, it is of the utmost necessity that this martial law is allowed to
Uh-huh.
take place. And
Okay.
they actually, Dr. Webb, I don't know if you're familiar with the jurist Hans Kelsen. I don't know if you know of him, but Hans Kelsen
Yep.
was a German. Yeah, so
Philosopher.
he
Yep.
came up. Yeah, German philosopher. He came up with something called revolution, the theory of revolution. Like a constitution can be destroyed if a revolution takes place, and in
Hmm.
the new, so that he says that the entire primary law system gets erased by the new revolution. So our court actually relied on Kelsen's theory to to support the idea of the
Override. Yeah.
doctrine of
Yeah.
necessity. And this was so ridiculous because Hans Kelsen actually revised this in the 70s and he said that was insane. He's like, that's not what my theory was arguing. And I was not legitimizing martial law. But so that has been a stain on our judicial history for decades, for like half for since Pakistan was created. So there's not anything explicitly like that in our constitution. However, there are some constitutional rights that have been utterly suspended. There are some that are unsuspendable, if that's a word. But yeah, this is a very big debate. So very interesting question that you asked.
Well, we'll leave that aside. And I
Yeah,
wasn't talking about an overriding. The way it works in Canada under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is on a particular issue, if the
yeah,
government can persuade the court that there is a pressing and substantial need to
yeah,
override a particular right in that particular situation, and the court will
yeah,
assess it using something called the Oakes test in Canada. And if they
yeah,
feel that it does, then in that particular situation, so it's not the equivalent of what you're talking about,
that
which is like a complete overriding of the Constitution. But I would like to suggest, Hashim, that we not proceed down that rabbit hole any further for the moment,
okay, yeah,
because let's get back to your particular situation. And so it has resulted in this court order, effectively, to shut down all of these, some approximately 900 different crushing operations across your province. So I'm taking
yeah,
it that it's very quiet in your province these days, and the air is very clear. Is that the case? Like
yeah,
it actually did stop and has continued
yeah.
to stop all of
So
these?
So actually, our city is clean. Abtabad is a very clean city, and the other areas. So this is something that requires further enforcement. The EPA has filed cases against every machine in the province, all of them. However, the EPA is being selective or a little bit relaxed as to who it enforces against, if that person can convince them, whether it be through bribery, through threat, whatever it may be. Hey, just leave us alone. You go do your pretend job, and we're going to keep crushing. And I actually said this in court. I said, the law is not the deterrent, it's me. I was like, if I'm not here, they're going to do the same thing, and that's a big problem. And what has happened is every machine that I've pursued, so we've managed to shut down the largest crush plants in the province. They were owned by very strong political, like our members of government. We managed to shut those down. We shut down all of ours in the area. There were about 23 here that were shut down, about 50 more in another area. Like every area that I've focused on has been enforced completely. The areas where people have not been able to contact me because they don't understand like what's happening, and because nobody is there to challenge the department's lack of compliance with the court, that's led to a problem. But I filed a separate petition because I knew that would happen. I did file a separate petition once again after that landmark ruling. And the court actually summoned the director general in person. He said, "Why are you not complying with our judgment?" But before proper things could happen, the director general actually got transferred, and the secretary of environment got transferred. Things were going on because this judgment has had a significant impact on this industry as a whole. So there's different aspects to it. So yeah, in our area, clean, nice, peaceful city. Very, the traffic has reduced a lot, but in other areas, there's still room for enforcement.
Okay. Well, two topics we want to talk about now. One is the rule of law. So
Okay.
we're going to unpack that in a moment. The second is this concept of impact and benefit agreements. Let me say, first of all, that, earlier on at the beginning of this particular session, I mentioned the concept of sustainable governance. And I said how that requires that all three of government, the private sector, and civil society have got important roles to play. And your point about that it took you individually going before the courts in order to ensure that the law actually was going to be applied. That's an example of where civil society has got a very critically important role to play, very much in keeping with this concept of sustainable governance. But what we haven't talked about is a potential other role, and that's a role for industry. And that takes us to this concept of impact and benefit agreements, or as they're sometimes called, IBAs, just impact benefit agreements. So impact benefit agreements were first developed in Canada by mining operations in Canada that wanted to go to the communities where they were going to have an impact or where they were having an impact, and just directly dealing with that community and saying to that community, look, we want to do this thing over here, dig this hole, do this stuff over here, which we know is going to be disruptive to you guys. But what we can do is we can do things for you. So is there a way we can kind of work this out so that simultaneously we get what we want, which is the stuff out of the ground, and you get what you want, which is a clean environment, possibly some new infrastructure, new roads, new water treatment facility, and so on, which incidentally we need as well for our plant, for our workers, and so on. So this concept of impact benefit agreements was developed in Canada, and it has evolved since then. And it's used in other jurisdictions as well. It's being given by a government to a industry proponent because the industry proponent brings to the attention of the uh, approving entity of the government. We have talked to the community, and the community has agreed to this impact benefit agreement. So that's oftentimes how it's happened. I don't want to present impact benefit agreements as being the best thing since sliced bread, because there are power differences between a mining operation and a local community. And it's possible, for example, for a mining corporation to have undue influence over the terms of an impact benefit agreement, at which point it's not going to be particularly good for the community. But in a lot of situations in Canada, the community actually gets support from, for example, lawyers to assist them in the negotiation of an impact benefit agreement. So that kind of evens things up. But at any rate, they are effectively contractual agreements between the companies and the communities, but they are legal agreements, but they can be brought to the attention of courts and environmental tribunals and environmental improvement agencies of one sort or another as part of their decision making. So that's a little bit of background on impact benefit agreements. And then we see coming up a session coming up in January through the CSR Institute, where in Nigeria, they've moved to a legislated form of impact benefit agreements. And I'll be talking to an individual, a lawyer from Nigeria, about that in early January. But I wanted to talk about that, and I know you wanted to talk about that, because looking forward, you've said, I want to come up with a solution to this situation, not just a band-aid, we've stopped the crushing operations from going on, but what's a more permanent legislated solution? So why don't you tell me about your thinking about that at this stage?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, Dr. Webb, this all started when I had my discussions with yourself and with Professor Chris McDonald. Before I understood, like, the law has to change, and we need to come up with a different solution. I first wanted to understand the ethics of what I was doing, and Professor Chris McDonald was my ethics professor, and I wanted to speak to him like, hey, I'm going against my own family. This is insane. This creates enemies, and he said, well, you got to think about it not just from your point of view, you have to think about it from others. And you said roughly the same thing where you helped me understand that on the one hand is the environment, and on the other hand, there's a material that is quite relevant and useful and used in modern day construction, which is construction material. So the mineral that's being mined is limestone, and out of that limestone is building material that's used in our roads and our buildings, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So when we what from what I can gather and what I can understand, living in Canada is one of the it's a mineral superpower, essentially, a mining authority of the world. But I have never seen a mining site in my life in Toronto because it doesn't that would be insane. Like that would just be stupid. Because the government has some form of a regulation that I'm assuming that it regulates the distance, it regulates the location, it regulates how and where any of this can take place. Such a concept is in Pakistan, but it's largely being regulated for completely selfish reasons. Like, for example, our law says that crush machines must be at a minimum 300 meters away in a rural area and 500 meters away in an urban area from society, from roads, from mosques, schools, etc. So first of all, that's unconstitutional in the sense that why are poor people, why do they have lesser rights than urban area, richer people? And I'm challenging that law right now as well, and the government does not want me to challenge it. But the legislation, it has to be changed because from what I could understand, so even in our law right now, our law mandates that surface rent agreements must be registered with the district administration. So surface rent agreement says that the landlord and the leaseholder have to enter into an agreement, and then they can, once the term and conditions are set, they're registered with us, then they can commence mining. However, as far as I know, there's very little leaseholders that are actually fulfilling that surface rent agreement, despite the fact that it has some sort of a contractual some sort of a legislative backing. It's still a contract that is largely neglected. So I'm starting to like I'm formulating the opinion that even IBAs might not be sufficient because I believe that contractual rights, despite having legislative backing, are just they appear to be an ineffective remedy. When I was looking into the IBAs, I think if the law mandates like some sort of a reporting provision, like something whereby the community acquires a stake, an equity within the mine itself, then the community all of a sudden has reason to want the mine to succeed, and they will have reason for the mine to at least be environmentally compliant so that they don't die themselves. But I believe that a private contract on its own without legislative backing, without primary law, is useless
Right?
because
Agreed. Agreed.
yeah,
Yeah.
100% ineffective.
Well, and
But whereas,
that is the case in Canada. In Canada, before a mining project can take place, it has to go through an environmental impact assessment process,
yeah,
which is where the government approves it or doesn't approve it. And it is at that stage that a proponent, a mining company, for example, would say,
yeah,
Your Honor, environmental authority, please approve this because we've already gone to the community, and the community is in favor of this project going ahead because we're doing the following things to reduce the impact. They have an equity share in the operation. They are going to be involved in the monitoring, the environmental and other monitoring of it, and so on and so forth. And so there is like a backstop to this contract. There's a backstop. The contract doesn't happen on its own. It happens in
yeah,
conjunction with an absolute regulatory approval or disapproval of the project taking place at all in the first place. So you're absolutely correct. It's not just a contract with no backing, statutory or regulatory backing behind
Yeah,
it. There is a regulatory regime that either allows
yeah,
or doesn't allow that activity to take place in the first place, and then overlaid on top of that, there could be a impact benefit agreement, or as might be what be happening now in Nigeria, the impact benefit agreement can be legislated right into the process. That's a
yeah,
possibility. But at any rate, again, I'm not wanting you here and now to get into the nitty gritty or the gravelly, dusty aspects of this particular situation, because there's some other things we want to talk about. Now, I know you're exploring that, and you're going to continue
yeah.
to look into how things can be made better through law. But let's talk about the rule of law. So,
Okay.
the rule of law basically is this idea that nobody is above the law, and that we have this separation of judiciary, legislative, and executive as part of this way of ensuring that no part of the decision-making process is operating with complete power. There's the judiciary is a check and balance on the executive, and it's a check and balance on the legislature, and the legislature is a check and balance on the executive and on the judiciary, and so on, right? So we
Yeah,
have this thing called the rule of law, which is designed to make sure that nobody is above the law. The president is not above the law if you have a president. The prime minister is not above the law if you have a prime minister. The environmental agency is not above the law. A particular company is not above the law. They all must comply with the law. If you have a lot of corruption, for example, judges are corrupt, police are corrupt, environmental regulatory agencies are corrupt, then you don't have the rule of law, because basically the law doesn't have to be complied with. It can be got around, right? And your story is a story of, on the one hand, the success. The rule of law has worked. You went to the court, there was a law. You went to
yeah,
the court upheld the law and said, you over there in that environmental agency, you were not behaving properly. You now have to behave properly. And you, industry, you now have to behave properly. So that's a rule of law success story.
yeah,
And it's an unlikely success story because my understanding is there's a huge problem with corruption in Pakistan. But somehow or other, these various different parts did work properly in your particular case, in this particular case. But my understanding is there has been amendments to the Constitution that have just taken place quite recently. Can you tell me a little bit
yeah.
about that?
Yes. So, Dr. Webb, firstly, you're absolutely right about that there is a big problem of corruption. Pakistan is regularly ranked in the bottom percentile of judicial strength, and that I think is a mixture of both judicial corruption as well as complete failure by the lawyers themselves. And what has happened recently is that the 27th constitutional amendment was passed a couple of weeks ago. And that has led to a vast amount of criticism because a large amount of the population believes that the 27th Amendment has eroded judicial independence. And there is a complete executive domination. Whereas I would have sort of a different opinion. I would argue that because there is there's an ongoing debate whether parliament is supreme, the judiciary is supreme, whether there's an actual check and balances, whatever. But I believe that the 27th constitutional amendment, so here are the major changes that matter as to why people believe that there's now it's an executive dominant constitution. So before we our courts hierarchy was the lower courts, the district and session courts, then you'd have the high court, and then you'd have the apex court, which is your supreme court. Now, the 27th Amendment has introduced something called the Federal Constitutional Court. It sits on the tier above the Supreme Court. And besides the FCC, the Federal Constitutional Court, the appointment of judges has been transferred to something called the Judicial Commission of Pakistan and the JCP, the Judicial Commission. The JCP is largely the members of the JCP are politicians or members of the executive. It's not the judiciary is not selecting the judges. It's the executive that is selecting the judges. And aside from that, they have introduced another provision into the Constitution that says that a judge can be transferred at the whim of the JCP or the executive, and a judge who refuses the transfer will just automatically be deemed to be retired, which is absolutely insane because all of this came because um, some junior judges from another province were transferred to the capital city's High Court of Islamabad. And in the Islamabad High Court, there was a huge power struggle. Who's going to be the chief justice, and how did some a junior person all of a sudden become the chief justice? But why, like, why are these transfers legal? They shouldn't be allowed. And it was so insane that five of our Islamabad High Court judges actually filed a constitutional petition before the Supreme Court challenging the transfer of their colleague. So judges were litigants against their fellow judges. So imagine the shock that that would have on the average person. An average person would say, if a judge can't get relief, or if he has to seek relief in the Supreme Court, then what is the state of your average litigant? So the 27th constitutional amendment also it led to very significant changes into one particular person's post, which was the chief of the army staff. So in our country, the chief of the army staff is the one who leads the army, and the COAS, the chief of the army staff, he essentially got a consolidation of powers whereby he received lifetime immunity as well as he became the chief of the joint staff as well. And one other post was completely eroded, and essentially he became a constitutional body with lifetime immunity even after retirement. So a lot of people
Okay.
question. So they said that's crazy. Like, why is it that this constitution is being specifically amended for one person? And why is it that the judiciary has completely disappeared? But
Okay.
as I said earlier, it was this very same judiciary that legitimized martial law, that legitimized the abrogation of a constitution, that legitimized the PCOs. So a valid question arises: why are you aggrieved by the existence of the Federal Constitutional Court when the Supreme Court itself has already been uh, the backbone of severe constitutional illegalities? So some people believe that the FCC, because those judges will be selected by the executive, it essentially leads you can draw the conclusion that, okay, so the Supreme Court, before perhaps the executive had to threaten judges, perhaps they had to bribe them, perhaps they had to blackmail them, whatever, in order to get them to pass a favorable judgment. However, the FCC completely trumps everything. Why the
Mhm.
executive just decided, wait, we don't want any more of this debate between whether the judiciary can control us. We're just going to appoint our own judges. And if they
And they'll
say
do
this
what
is
we
the law,
want.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then this is the law.
Okay.
But in our, yes, one other aspect. In our country, before, the Supreme Court had a power which was known as the suo motu power. So suo motu meant that the judiciary could, of its own cognizance, sorry, only the Supreme Court of its own cognizance could summon a matter, bring a matter before it. So if the Supreme Court felt that this particular building is not being designed properly, they could start summoning everyone, and this led to an
Mhm.
abuse of power. Debatably, some judges were misusing that power. We had some of our judges began controlling the affairs of, hey, the country should build a dam. It's like, you're a judge. Why are you concerned with
Mhm. Mhm.
whether a dam is being built? Why are you dismissing prime ministers were dismissed by
Mhm.
the court? This led to just like a complete just explosion because the executive has a valid argument. They're saying, why is there so much judicial interference? But the good judges also have a valid argument to be like, hey, we should be independent. We should be able to pass our own judgments. So this is a huge debate
Yeah.
right now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I really just wanted to give our audience an idea of the significance of the rule of law. In a country like Canada, we assume that everything is operating properly, that judges are just staying to judging, and that legislatures are just staying to legislating, and that regulatory agencies are just applying the law and nothing more. That's the assumption. right? Then there we find instances of corruption, instances where someone is bribed, and that leads to legal actions, tends to, and so those are exposed and so on. But we can see how things can be corroded and eroded from that everything's working fine model. And I'm not going to go into any details, but we can see it in some of the most powerful countries of the world right now, where there's efforts made by certain individuals to arrange things so that they consider themselves to be above the law and they can do whatever it is they want and they can manipulate who is on the court and what the court says. They can manipulate what's going on in the legislatures and they can manipulate what's going on in the executive. Not going into any details there, but I'm kind of using the situation of Pakistan to show how you can go from having a rule of law system that's operating properly to a chaotic situation where it just becomes brute power that is effectively running things. And you are navigating that sort of fast evolving situation in Pakistan. Final point, because we're kind of running out of time here. Tell me a little bit more about some of these other cases that you're taking on. For example, I hear you're taking on a case on behalf of or working with the World Wildlife Fund for Nature.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm actually representing the World Wild Fund for Nature, which is the WWF, and we are litigating against the Hilton Hotel. So the Hilton has licensed its hotel, which is known as the DoubleTree by Hilton, to a local company, and that company is owned by a holding company in Dubai, and it's a very interesting case because it involves a high level of provincial cabinet corruption and a very high level of manipulation of land records, as well as the hotel. I believe, I am arguing that the hotel is built on reserved forest land and inside of a national park. So, like, think about Canada is absolutely beautiful. Our national parks are incredible because there's no construction inside of them because the government is strict on that. However, I hear that is changing a little bit. But before we go in there, my litigation against Hilton primarily revolves around environmental compliance as well as uh, a complete negligence by a government department that is essentially operating as a housing society and selling government land at exorbitant rates, and they are personally benefiting it. And interestingly enough, the former director general, he's actually now living in Canada, living a very rich life, a very questionable source of means. And aside from that, I primarily take cases against the government because I believe the government is doing a lot of wrong to the citizens. I'm in a very big, significant litigation against the cantonment boards. That word might even be unfamiliar to people because I had never heard of it. So a cantonment is essentially a military base inside
Uh,
of a civilian area. Yeah, it was a historical British concept. When the British first came to Pakistan, they set up cantonments. So it was their own military barracks inside of an enemy land. So, they needed to be safe. So they set up cantonment areas. However, for whatever reason, cantonment areas, despite the British's removal from Pakistan, or they left, they still continue to exist, and they're
hmm,
operating with their own set of laws. And the cantonment is taking property taxes from the citizens, and I'm arguing that's against our constitution. So I think in Canada we have Article 91 and 92, the lists, the
hmm.
provincial and federal list. So I'm arguing that property tax is a provincial subject, and whereas cantonment boards are federal entities, so therefore they lack constitutional competence. And right now, I have interim relief, and the court has restrained them from the collection of property tax. So that's a big one too. The cantonment's exerting a lot of pressure. They're like, withdraw your writ, man. You're costing us billions of billions of tax money.
Well,
That's it. No, yeah, it's a
Hashim,
lot of yeah.
you are what I would characterize as an environmental and human rights defender. Now, that doesn't stop you from taking on litigation that does not have to do with the environment or human rights, and I believe you're doing that. And of course, you have every right to do that. As an environmental and human rights defender, this means that you could be the target of someone who wants to intimidate you and prevent you from carrying on, or a member of your family, as the case might be. And unfortunately, this is an issue around the world. And unfortunately, there's been just in the past year, in 2024, more than 200 environmental and human rights defenders lost their lives entirely. So I want to end off this discussion now, first of all, by saying, please be careful. And I know a court has said that to you as well. I also wish you well. I'm also going to suggest that we need to have another chat because in some ways we want to catch up with where things are going to be, in several months, but also because I feel as if we've had to kind of rush a lot of our conversation here today. So let's see if we can arrange another chat down the line. But
I'd love to.
let me say now, on behalf of Toronto Metropolitan University and in particular the CSR Institute, my thanks for you taking the time to do this. Wish you continued success with your work, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Webb. And honestly, I would love to be back. So thank you so much for the
Terrific.
opportunity.
All the
Thank you.
best.
Take care. Bye.
Bye now.